The standoff didn't begin with warnings or weapons. It began with tracking data that stopped making sense. As a Russian-flagged tanker moved steadily through open water under US surveillance, something unseen slipped into the picture. No surface contact, no radio traffic. Just a sudden change in how the sea behaved on American sensors. What had looked like a routine sanctions enforcement pursuit quietly escalated into something far more serious. According to reports, Russia deployed a submarine, not to threaten, not to confront, but to shadow. The message was subtle and deliberate. This ship was no longer alone. In modern naval confrontations, submarines aren't sent for show. They're sent to change calculations. Their presence forces restraint, complicates decision-making, and raises the cost of every next move. Once an underwater escort enters the equation, boarding operations stop being procedural and start becoming political. What followed wasn't a clash, but a pause. A moment where both sides understood that the margin for error had just narrowed, and that any misstep could turn a quiet pursuit into an international incident. This wasn't about speed or firepower, it was about control, visibility, and who was willing to take the risk when most of the battlefield was hidden beneath the waves. The pursuit was supposed to be routine. A Russian-flagged tanker, suspected of sanctions evasion and linked to Venezuelan oil flows, was moving through international waters under steady US surveillance. No erratic maneuvers, no radio challenges, just a slow, deliberate transit that suggested compliance, or at least calculation. For American planners, this was familiar territory. Track the vessel, apply pressure, prepare legal and operational options for interception or boarding if required. Then the data shifted. Not dramatically, not in a way that triggered alarms, just enough to raise questions. Acoustic readings stopped aligning the way they had minutes earlier. The underwater picture, once clean, grew ambiguous. Nothing visible surfaced, no aircraft appeared, no warnings were exchanged. But for the operators watching the screens, the environment no longer felt empty. That was the moment the pursuit stopped being procedural. According to reports, Russia had quietly inserted a submarine into the operating area, assigning it an escort role. Not a surface warship, not an overt show of force. An underwater asset designed to be present without being seen, to influence behavior without ever announcing itself. Submarines are not deployed casually in situations like this. Their value isn't in confrontation, but in uncertainty. Once a submarine is believed to be nearby, every assumption changes. Boarding operations become risk calculations. Maneuvers that were once routine now carry strategic weight. Even communication protocols tighten, because escalation no longer depends on visible intent alone. For US forces, the question was no longer just legal authority or rules of engagement. It was geometry, distance, depth, time. A submarine doesn't need to do anything to matter. Its mere presence complicates the environment enough to slow decisions at every level. For Russia, the message was carefully calibrated. This was not an attempt to challenge American naval dominance directly. There were no threats, no declarations, no aggressive movements on the surface. Instead, Moscow signaled something subtler. The tanker was under protection, and any action against it would no longer be isolated. This was not about winning a confrontation. It was about raising the cost of action without crossing the line into open conflict. High-seas standoffs rarely look dramatic in real time. There are no cinematic turns or warning shots. What happens, instead is restraint, layered on top of restraint. Each side waits for the other to blink, not out of fear, but out of calculation. When submarines enter the picture, patience becomes a weapon. The tanker continued on its course. US assets maintained their distance. The sea, on the surface, appeared unchanged. But beneath it, the balance of the encounter had shifted. The pursuit had become a standoff, shaped not by force, but by the quiet understanding that escalation would now carry consequences neither side wanted to test. This was no longer just about a ship. It was about control, credibility, and how far each side was willing to go without saying a word. At sea, power isn't measured only by what can be seen. It's measured by what forces hesitation. Before the submarine entered the picture, the situation followed a familiar pattern. A tanker under suspicion. US naval and intelligence assets maintaining contact. Legal reviews running in parallel with operational planning. These encounters happen more often than the public realizes, and most of them end quietly. A course change, a delay, sometimes a boarding, sometimes nothing at all. The calculus was manageable. A submarine made it something else entirely. Unlike surface escorts, submarines don't signal intent through posture. They don't line up on radar screens or announce presence with visible movement. Their power lies in denial. Denying certainty, denying clean options, denying the confidence required to act decisively. Once one is believed to be operating nearby, every plan has to account for the unknown. For US commanders, that uncertainty matters most during moments that require proximity. Boarding a tanker is not a symbolic act. It involves helicopters, small boats, personnel on exposed decks, and predictable movement patterns. Those operations are safe only when the surrounding environment is controlled. A submarine, even one doing nothing, disrupts that control. It doesn't need to lock weapons. It doesn't need to maneuver aggressively. It only needs to exist. That existence induces risk in ways that are difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. Commanders don't just ask whether an action is lawful or justified. They ask whether it's survivable under worst-case assumptions. Submarines are built to force those assumptions. For Russia, this was a low-visibility, high-impact move. Sending a surface escort would have been louder, more confrontational, and politically harder to walk back. A submarine offered deniability without ambiguity. No announcement was required, no confirmation needed. The implication alone was sufficient. The message wasn't, "Don't touch the tanker." It was, "Touching it won't be simple anymore." That distinction matters. This wasn't an attempt to trigger a crisis or force a showdown. It was an effort to slow the timeline, to buy space, to ensure that any US decision would be weighed not just against international law, but against strategic consequence. In modern naval operations, delay itself can be a form of success. What followed was exactly that. Restraint. Assets stayed in place, but actions paused. Monitoring continued, but movement narrowed. Communications became more deliberate. No one rushed to escalate a situation that had quietly grown more complex than it appeared on the surface. High seas confrontations often end this way, not with outcomes, but with realizations. One side recognizes that pressing forward now carries costs disproportionate to the objective. The other understands that influence has been exerted without ever forcing a response. The tanker kept moving. The submarine remained unseen, and the standoff settled into an uneasy equilibrium, shaped less by power than by the shared understanding of how quickly miscalculation could turn pressure into crisis. What made the standoff dangerous wasn't aggression. It was restraint on both sides for very different reasons. For the United States, the objective had never been symbolic dominance. This wasn't about proving reach or humiliating an adversary. It was about enforcement, sanctions, credibility, and precedent. Letting a suspected tanker pass without consequence risked signaling weakness, not just to Russia, but to every state watching how far US authority actually extended on the open sea. But enforcement has limits. Once the possibility of a Russian submarine escort entered the picture, the margin for acceptable risk narrowed sharply. Any action against the tanker would no longer be isolated. A boarding gone wrong, a misread maneuver, even an equipment malfunction could escalate into a crisis involving assets neither side had intended to expose. The legal case might have been strong, but legality doesn't reduce torpedo ranges or reaction times. For Russia, the calculus was equally constrained. Moscow wasn't trying to force a confrontation with US naval forces. Doing so would have invited escalation it could not fully control. Instead, the goal was protection without provocation. By inserting a submarine quietly, Russia elevated the situation without crossing clear red lines. It signaled commitment without issuing threats, capability without demonstration. Backing down wasn't an option either. If the tanker had been boarded after the escort signal, the message would have been damaging. That Russian protection was symbolic rather than real. That kind of outcome carries consequences beyond a single ship. It affects future deterrence, future negotiations, and how far adversaries are willing to push in similar situations. So both sides paused, not because they were unsure, but because they understood too clearly what escalation would mean. At sea, hesitation is often misread as weakness. In reality, it is usually calculation. Every hour that passed without action allowed tempers to cool, lawyers to weigh in, intelligence to refine assessments, and commanders to look for exits that preserved credibility without inviting confrontation. This is how modern great power encounters often end, not with decisive outcomes but with controlled ambiguity. No press releases declaring victory, no clear admission of restraint, just ships maintaining distance, submarines remaining silent, and decisions quietly deferred. The tanker continued its transit. U.S. assets maintained surveillance. Russia avoided overt escalation. On paper, nothing was resolved. But in strategic terms, both sides achieved something important. The United States demonstrated persistence without recklessness. Russia demonstrated reach without provocation. Neither blinked, and neither forced the other to. The standoff didn't end with a command. It dissolved as priorities shifted, and risks outweighed rewards. That's the nature of high seas power politics, in an era where visibility is optional and escalation is instant. Sometimes the most consequential confrontations are the ones where nothing appears to happen, because everyone involved understands exactly what could. Beyond the tanker, beyond the submarine, this encounter revealed something more important about how power is being exercised at sea. Neither side was testing strength in the traditional sense. There were no formations meant for display, no aggressive maneuvers designed for cameras or headlines. Instead, both the United States and Russia operated inside a narrow band of pressure where influence is exerted quietly and mistakes carry disproportionate consequences. This was less about dominance and more about shaping behavior. For the United States, the signal was consistency. Surveillance continued. Legal frameworks were respected. Assets stayed in place without rushing the moment. That restraint wasn't hesitation, it was discipline. Washington demonstrated that enforcement doesn't require immediacy, only persistence. The message to observers was subtle but clear. Pressure can be sustained without forcing a confrontation that undermines its own legitimacy. For Russia, the signal was reach and intent without escalation. The reported submarine escort wasn't meant to seize control of the situation. It was meant to complicate it. By operating below the surface, literally and figuratively, Moscow reminded its adversaries that not all power needs to be visible to be effective. Protection, in this case, came not from proximity, but from uncertainty. What made the encounter notable was how precisely both sides avoided irreversible steps. No red lines were crossed, no ultimatums were issued. Each move left room for adjustment, retreat, or reinterpretation. That flexibility is not accidental. It reflects an understanding that modern naval confrontations rarely reward decisiveness when escalation ladders are short and miscalculation is permanent. This approach marks a shift from older doctrines. In the past, naval standoffs were often resolved through shows of force designed to force outcomes quickly. Today, the objective is often to delay, complicate, and exhaust options until the least dangerous path becomes the most attractive. Control isn't seized, it's negotiated silently through presence and patience. The tanker's continued movement without incident was not a failure of enforcement or deterrence. It was an outcome shaped by risk management. Both sides recognized that forcing a resolution in that moment would create more problems than it solved. The costs, political, military, and strategic, outweighed the benefits of action. This is the reality of high seas competition between major powers in 2026. Encounters unfold slowly. Decisions are filtered through layers of intelligence, law, and consequence. Victory is rarely declared, and defeat is rarely acknowledged. What matters is how situations end, not explosively, but controllably. In that sense, the standoff did exactly what both sides needed it to do. It reaffirmed boundaries without testing them. It reinforced capability without displaying it. And it reminded everyone watching that modern power at sea is less about who acts first and more about who can afford to wait